Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie, and I will be the moderator tonight. I'm excited to welcome Chip Fickner as our speaker this evening. Chip is the co-founder of Large Practice Sales, or LPS, which completed over $612 million of practice transitions in 2022 with 31 IDSOs as clients in 29 states. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to go over some quick housekeeping. If you have any questions, please email them to webinars@henryschein.com. And CE is not available for this webinar tonight. Chip, welcome, and thank you so much for being here tonight. And I'll pass it over to you now.
Fantastic. Thank you. And good evening, doctors. It is an exciting time in the dental world for a number of reasons. We're going to talk tonight about an invisible dental support organization and why thousands of doctors are partnering with these groups this year alone. In essence, an invisible dental support organization becomes your silent partner. They come in and buy anywhere from 51 to 90% of your practice for cash up front, with you retaining ownership in the balance and continuing to lead your practice for years or decades, accessing the resources of that larger partner. We'll talk about what those are here in a minute, but most importantly, retaining full autonomy. These groups have no desire to micromanage or homogenize your practice to fit some corporate standard. They're interested in investing in successful practices in which their resources can help you grow bigger, better, faster, and more profitably, and reduce some administrative burdens for you. So in our business, we're in the opportunity finding space. We're looking for great doctors who have built wonderful growing practices, who are interested in monetizing a part of their life's work, but not interested in leaving, transitioning, or retiring. Last year, in our $612 million of transactions, over $102 million were completed for doctors in their 30s. And that's causing some interesting challenges for doctors in their 60s, because the invisible DSOs would obviously rather partner with a doctor who has 10, 20, or 30 years of chairside horizon versus a doctor who may be my age, which is 63. And so it's important for doctors of all ages to understand the invisible DSO opportunity. And fortunately, the values that we are achieving today are setting new records. Part of that is because we have a record number of bidders, invisible DSO bidders, eager to partner with great practices. But last year, in part thanks to our practices growing and the increasing number of bidders, we managed to beat our initial value estimate by on average about 22%. We are growing to support the growth of the invisible DSO consolidation, and we have over 30 great team members. To give you an idea of the values that we achieve, shockingly, our highest value in 2022 was 545% of collections. Now, keep in mind, we don't measure value by collections like you might in a doctor-to-doctor transaction. We measure values based on EBITDA and other factors, and we'll talk about what EBITDA is and how it is calculated here in a minute. But fortunately, in an invisible DSO transaction, a doctor potentially achieves a value that's 2, 3, and sometimes 4 times as much as they might get in a traditional doctor-to-doctor transaction. Quick story about us. We have a very strong advisory board. Dr. Andy Brown, president of the Florida Dental Association, and as an orthodontist, that is an accomplishment to get 8,000 GPs to vote for you. Admiral Phil Davidson is number 227 in the history of the Navy to achieve the 4-star admiral status. He's been a little busy the last couple of weeks. And on this slide, Mitch Olin is the co-founder of one of the largest invisible DSOs in the country. It has been around for over 30 years now. Mitch retired from active involvement in that invisible DSO and currently sits on the board of several other invisible DSOs. And Bhavik Patel is our tax guru. He is a nationally known tax expert, and he helps us make sure that we structure transactions for our doctors to be most tax efficient. There's a quick look at some of our team members, and we are growing so fast that we don't have pictures for a couple of them. So it has been a busy time in creating invisible DSO partnerships, and this is why the invisible DSO category is growing so rapidly. The green line is the consistent growth of dental practice collections in the U.S. over the last almost 50 years, and the investors like stable, growing investments, and that is one of them. And so here's an example of an invisible DSO that is about 27 years old now. And as you can see, had you become a partner with this invisible DSO in the first 4 years of their existence, the value of your equity, that ownership you retained in the initial transaction, in this particular case, actually increased by 10 times. So had you kept $1 million in equity in this transaction, in 4 years, it would have been worth $10 million. And as you can see, as this group got bigger, the returns on that equity declined, but they continue to produce great returns for their investors and their doctors. And each of those red vertical lines represents a point where the investor sold to a bigger investor. This particular group happens to be owned now by one of the largest investment advisors in the world, and they are continuing to grow. So let's talk about DSOs and invisible DSOs. And shockingly, these numbers indicate that about 22% of all dentists in the U.S. today either work for or have partnered with a DSO or an invisible DSO. And as you can see, they come in a variety of sizes. And these numbers would disagree with the ADA's recent research report, which came out in May. The ADA believes that only 13% of all dentists across the country are affiliated with the DSO or invisible DSO, but they did point out that they believed 18% of all orthodontists had partnered with or were working for a DSO or an invisible DSO. So the data in this business is all about how you define a DSO or invisible DSO. But the basic math of creating value in an invisible DSO is that functionally, when they can buy a smaller practice, let's call it a practice with less than $1 million in operating profits, and add it into their group may be worth 14 times EBITDA, and some of these groups have traded as high as 20 times EBITDA. So every time they add a practice to their group by partnering with them, they're functionally doubling the value of that practice, which is what drives up the equity value of that group. Now, for years, they've been able to finance their acquisitions with low-cost leverage. The definition of low-cost leverage has changed as interest rates have gone up. But in the last 5 to 10 years, because the doctor is retaining a portion of the transaction in equity, functionally, these groups could leverage the entire transaction without investing any equity, which is what produced the phenomenal returns on equity that they have produced, and which is why over $10 billion in new investors invested in U.S. dental consolidation, primarily through the growth of invisible DSOs. Now, some of these groups are also very eager to grow organically through the synergies of the practices that they partner with. And we'll talk about a dental trifecta strategy, which is where invisible DSOs partner with pedos, orthos, and oral surgeons only to capture their referral sources, and they can create internal organic growth without marketing. So just in the last 120 days, our clients have had a record number of bidders, and we have been achieving record values, in particular for ortho, perio, GP, oral surgery, and pedo. So it's been an exciting time so far this year. Many people don't fully understand the relationship between Invisalign and Heartland, but Invisalign invested $75 million in Heartland earlier this year, and you can bet that Heartland is not paying $1,100 per case for an Invisalign case. 4 invisible DSOs did recapitalize and or refinance, so they have reloaded their ability to go partner with great doctors like you. So there are functionally 3 different types of DSOs in the U.S. today. The branded DSOs, we'll call them the Aspens, and they own 100% of the practices that they have. Now, certainly the doctors have a profit-sharing interest in the practice, but the doctors don't own any of the equity in the parent company, to my knowledge. The invisible DSOs, on the other hand, rarely own 100% of any practice, nor do they have doctors who are not owners either in the practice or the parent company, and they have no desire to rebrand the practice, micromanage it, or homogenize it to fit some sort of corporate standard. They're interested in successful practices that are unique and have become successful for their own reasons, which the invisible DSOs don't want to change. And the third type of DSOs are those that are growing through new starts, de novos. They are building out offices. Some of them are following a single brand, and others will have multiple brands across multiple strategies and geographies. So how does an invisible DSO differ from a DSO? It's really pretty simple. The invisible DSOs are not rebranding. The doctors are owners. They're not handing you a 3-ring binder and say, run your practice this way. The doctor is going to retain full autonomy. They're going to decide what clinical procedures they provide, how they do them, what products they use, what payers they take, who they hire, who they fire, what they pay them, what color to paint their lobby, and when to take a vacation. The invisible DSOs are not there to micromanage practices. Whereas on the other hand, the branded DSOs, which are going to own 100% of each of the practices within their family, they're going to dictate to their employee doctors, here's the brand, here's how you're going to operate, here's what you're going to do. Certainly none of these groups get involved in the clinical decisions, either the invisible DSOs or the DSOs. That is left up to the doctors. But there's no real doctor ownership in a traditional branded DSO. And the interesting thing is to look at the growth of the invisible DSOs. The model is fairly simple. The doctors will have the option to sell between 51 to 90% of the high value transactions. The doctor's going to commit to stay and lead his practice for at least 5 years. Certainly, we have done transactions where the doctors have stayed for shorter periods of time, but that has typically been in multi-doctor practices or special situations. And functionally, if you're a younger doctor, you are trading future ordinary income for long-term capital gains in the cash you get up front, plus the projected equity participation in the value or the equity growth in your value over the next 5, 10, 20, or 30 years. Now, keep in mind, all of these groups are very different, and they are financed in different ways. Doctors, for some reason, seem to think that the only backers of DSOs or invisible DSOs are private equity, and this is not true. Today, certainly private equity is a backer of many invisible DSOs, but we've done over $400 million in transactions with family offices in the last 3 years. SBICs are also backing invisible DSOs. Bank debt has built many invisible DSOs, and doctors own personal funds or multiple doctors who pooled together to build an invisible DSO using their own funds. One thing I want to note here is real infrastructure versus infrastructure light. 3 years ago, there were multiple invisible DSOs attempting to grow by aggregating revenues, meaning they were interested in partnering with practices for the revenues and the income that they generated, but they had not built out the infrastructures necessary to integrate those partnered practice and provide them with the services that would enable them to grow, reduce costs, reduce or increase reimbursement rates, et cetera. Several of those groups tried to recapitalize this year and were unsuccessful due to the fact that they had not built any real infrastructure. So keep an eye on what's going on out there, because they're telling us what is popular with the large investors. One of the interesting reasons that the younger doctors are partnering with invisible DSOs is they access capital and resources to grow. We call those the young builder doctors, and these are doctors who have started a practice, made it successful, started or bought another one, and today may have multiple practices and are eager to expand and build or buy more. The invisible DSOs love those doctors. They like growth-oriented doctors, and they have the capital to help the doctors do that. Today, we run into quite a few doctors who have expanded over the last 5 years and have done it via bank debt, and they're frankly having some challenges now that their interest rates are exceeding 10% versus 3 or 4% 2 years ago. The other things that the invisible DSOs are going to look at is, does your practice have synergies with other partner practices, either within the enterprise nationally or locally? So they can be very interested in clients that have specific skills or successes which can be shared with other practices across their network. Obviously, they're going to reduce your supplies and equipment costs, and that includes technology. And given the increases in team benefits that are going on right now, which if you haven't seen your latest proposed increase, it's going up a lot. We were just talking about hours today. And so these groups are going to have better benefits available for your team members at a lower cost than you can provide for them. Another thing that's interesting with the invisible DSOs is their ability to recruit. Today, all of the invisible DSOs will want to create a path to ownership for your associates, either the current ones or future ones you have to hire. And interestingly, several of the invisible DSOs are now offering equity opportunities for non-doctor key team members so that you can put handcuffs on them and they don't leave to make $3 an hour more down the street. So they have some interesting recruiting and retention resources that you may not have. So let's talk about the reasons why doctors today, not last year or the year before, are considering an invisible DSO partnership. Part of it is because we're educating the doctors that they do not lose their autonomy. That is the number one issue with doctors is, are they really going to come in and tell me what to do or not? And our promise to them is they are not. However, let's prove it to you by introducing you to other doctors who have partnered with the finalist that you are down to through our bidding process. And you're going to talk doc to doc and hear exactly what changed, what didn't change, did they do what they said they would do, and are they happy? And a lot is changing right now in that if you have a larger practice, at the moment, your only exit option may be through an invisible DSO partnership if you want to achieve market value. Certainly, the branded DSOs are eager to partner with or buy 100% of practices, but they're typically paying the doc-to-doc values of 60, 70, 80% of collections, whereas the invisible DSOs are paying much higher values because they're functionally not just buying a business, they are partnering with a doctor and the doctor is going to stick around. Right now, we are achieving record values for our practices. I believe that we are seeing the peak in values. Does that mean I believe that values are going to crash in the near future? No, I do not. But I think ultimately interest rates are taking their toll, and I believe that bids will begin to decrease in the coming months. If your collections are flat or down, your value in the future will be impacted. So if you believe that we're potentially going to have a recession, you potentially may have lower collections, now may be the time to understand the value of your practice in an IDSO partnership. This to me is a very interesting thing to understand. If you go back 6 years ago, there were no oral surgery only invisible DSOs. Today, this number is actually a little dated. There are now 16 oral surgery only invisible DSOs, and they are competing against the 10 dental trifecta groups, which is up from 2 just 1 year ago. The dental trifecta groups partner only with pedo, ortho, and oral surgery. But the growth in all of the categories of dentistry, and I don't have GP on here, but the GPs have also probably added at least 100 invisible DSOs in the last 3 years. And these groups are growing fast. One of the reasonably well-known multi-specialty invisible DSOs, we partnered office number 38 with them about 6 years ago, and we recently partnered number 604 with them. So in less than 6 years, they've gone from 37 offices to over 600 offices. Dental surgical trifectas, these are groups that are interested in perio, endo, and oral surgery only, are also growing. This is an example of just one of them that went from 8 offices to 234 in 32 months. And today, the booming category is implant on all-on-X focused practices, and those may be GPs that are doing over 50% of their revenues in implant or all-on-X related care. They could be oral surgeons, and the implant-only groups are very eager for perios, and it has created a whole new class of bidders for periodontists across the country. Prior to the existence of the implant and the surgical trifecta groups, perios really only bidders were the multi-specialty groups in their area. So today, the world is different for implant and perio practices than it was 2 years ago. So the big promise in these transactions is that if you retain equity in your practice or in the parent company, that ultimately that equity may increase in value dramatically. We had over 100 of our clients participate in recapitalizations, meaning they had the opportunity to liquidate all or part of the equity they had received in transactions going back 4 years. And of those over 100 opportunities, many of our clients hung on to the equity that they had received because they were young and they were looking forward to the next recapitalization 3 to 5 years from now. But those that did liquidate some of their equity or all, the worst return for the doctors was a group of doctors that we partnered about 4.5 years ago with a large invisible DSO, and their equity only returned 25% per year compounded over that 4.5-year rate of return. Now, compared to normal investments, that's a pretty good return. I wish my investment portfolio had done that over the last 4 years. And on the best case scenario, we had partnered a great orthodontic practice with a relatively new invisible DSO that we then helped partner another 109 offices with in 39 months. And because that orthodontist got in early, his transaction was valued at about $17 million. He took $12 million of that in cash, or about 70%. He took $5 million of that in equity, or about 30%, and his $5 million in equity, 35 months after completing his transaction, had grown in value from $5 million to over $35 million. So not a bad return in less than 35 months. So the benefits for younger doctors are that you're going to have more bidders, and therefore you will achieve a higher value in most cases. The fact that these groups are going to take over a lot of the administrative functions for you is going to give you more time with your families. We see that as a real driver as to why younger doctors are doing these transactions. And again, the equity multiple upside. So if you kept $1 million in equity and your new partner recapitalized at 3 times its investment value, 3 times over 15 years. So every 5 years they recapitalized, which is not uncommon. That $1 million in equity you retained is now worth $27 million. And keep in mind that that equity you received was not taxable when you got it. And you are not taxed on the equity increase until you liquidate that retained equity in the future. Now, what tax rates will be in the future, I don't know. I'm projecting that after elections, tax rates are going to have to go up only to attempt to balance our budget, or at least get closer, rather than the $1.695 trillion deficit, a new record that we ran for the fiscal year ending September 30th. But I believe taxes are going up. We'll see. Now, the other thing to think about with invisible DSOs is that they can be your friend. They can give you cash. They can give you support. They can give you leverage with payers. They also give you a guaranteed exit strategy. But when an invisible DSO comes into your community, you need to be aware of who they are and what they're doing. So as a real world example, we had a client who was a large orthodontist, an absolute, probably the hardest working orthodontist I've ever met, who was producing $6.2 million in collections out of 2 offices by himself with no associates, but he had 28 great assistants. This doctor became our client, and obviously the right partner for him was the invisible DSO that owned the 5 largest pedo practices in the city where they were, that were all within referral distance of his 2 offices. And so once my client partnered with the invisible DSO that had the 5 pediatric practices, the other 4 orthodontists in town stopped getting the 1,500 ortho case referrals that were coming out of those 5 pediatric practices. And those practices saw, and I'm estimating this, probably production declines of at least 25 to 30% thereafter. And so functionally, those orthodontic practices became unsellable in my world because none of the invisible DSOs are interested in partnering with a group that has massive production decline. So you need to be fully cognizant of the invisible DSOs that are probably already in your community and those that may be coming to your community, especially if you rely on referrals, because this is not just true in pedo and ortho, this is also true in any other referral-based practice. Now, keep in mind that with the rapid growth of the invisible DSOs and the billions of dollars that have been pumped into these, some of these groups are better than others. And while we have not seen any major failures of invisible DSOs, some will fail. And so you have to be very careful and fully understand the partner that you're choosing and what is their long-term exit value plan for that ownership piece you kept. Because if they fail, that ownership piece that you kept may become worth nothing. Now, fortunately, there are far fewer invisible DSOs that have had financial trouble or have failed than just about any other industry out there. And so this is not high risk. As long as you're careful, I believe that if you do your due diligence on your potential partner, that you will not have any issues with the value on your equity. But if you try and do one of these transactions by yourself, you really don't know the difference between the good ones and the bad ones. We do. Dental trifectas, we helped build a dental trifecta over a 36-month period of time. That particular group went from my idea in the summer of 19 to 211 offices by September of 22. We partnered 110 practices out of their 211 practices with them. And when that group recapped at a new record multiple of 20 times EBITDA, everybody was pretty happy. Now, demographics are driving values to some degree. If you are in Florida, Tennessee, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, Utah or Idaho, and I did say Arizona, you have the most desirable practices because you are in areas that are growing. Now, does that mean if you're in an area with shrinking populations, including California, Illinois, New York, that you have an unsellable practice? Absolutely not. Does it mean you will have fewer bidders? Possibly. But we won't take a client unless we can identify before we take that client at least 6 qualified bidders for that client. And in many cases, we have far more bidders than that. But a lot of things are changing in this business today. And being in a growing state is better than being in a shrinking state. So number one myth, and I have talked about this from the start, but you are going to retain your autonomy. You're going to get to talk to other doctors to confirm that you will retain your autonomy, and you can get contractual guarantees that will ensure that you retain your autonomy. Now, let's talk about EBITDA. EBITDA is this great mysterious number upon which practice's initial value is calculated, and it's really not that complicated. It is your net profit after adding back interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and most importantly, compensation for you. Many doctors who I talk to say, before this call, I got on the phone with my accountant and he told me that my EBITDA was $1 million. I said, that's great. When he calculated that number, how much did he assume that you were going to be getting paid? Oh, well, he didn't assume that. That's just how much money I took out of the practice last year, and therefore that's my EBITDA, right? And I was like, no, it's really not. So if you have 2 million in collections and you took home $1 million last year, to calculate your EBITDA, we have to factor in some sort of compensation number for you. And in your market, a typical associate would probably be getting paid 35% of collections. Therefore, your new partner will have to pay you 35% of $2 million in collections, which is $700,000. So the actual EBITDA of your practice is not the $1 million that you thought it was, it's $300,000. So calculating EBITDA is unfortunately not a science. It's actually an art, because each of the invisible DSOs will use a different formula when calculating the EBITDA of a practice that they're interested in partnering with. And those formulas will vary dramatically. I'll give you a great example. Some of the groups are paying $800 for a famous famous brand clear aligner. Sorry about that. And most doctors are paying 11 to 12 or more for that same brand. And many of these groups will give you the benefit when calculating your EBITDA of the differential between what they're paying for something and what you're paying. So in that example, let's say you're doing 200 Invisalign cases a year, and the differential is $300 times 200 cases is $60,000 increase in your EBITDA. And if your practice is worth 8 times EBITDA, that means the value of your practice with that particular buyer is going to be $480,000 higher than it might be with another buyer that doesn't have either that low cost on the famous brand clear aligner or doesn't allow us to add that in there when calculating EBITDA. So understanding how EBITDA is calculated and negotiating how your EBITDA is calculated is a critical piece to achieving the highest values. And we're going to show you a couple of examples of that. Again, I believe that if a doctor does not have at least 6 bidders, you are leaving money on the table. And we'll give you a couple of stories of real world examples of where doctors left 1, 2, 5, 10, and even $20 million on the table until we saved them. So you have lots of options. If you're a great practice and you're growing, you have many options, and you should consider all of your options, not just to get a higher value, but to understand who you want to live with for the next 5, 10, or 20 years. So here's some actual transactions that have occurred in 2023. And as you can see here, the EBITDA calculation in case study number 1, as done by the buyers, not by us, ranged from $1,520,000 to $2,805,000. So if EBITDA is such a straightforward calculation, how did the bidder range be about $1,300,000 differential? Well, that's because the calculation of EBITDA is more art and negotiation than it is science. Now, in the particular case of this practice, the value of the bids as a multiple of EBITDA ranged pretty dramatically. So you've got a 3.5x range between 7.95 and 11.52. And if you apply that to a $2.8 million EBITDA, you're looking at a $8 to $9 million value differential in how these are calculated. In these transactions, one of the things that everybody looks at is the amount of cash to equity. In this particular example, the bids, one bidder offered 45% of the overall value in cash and 55% in equity. And another bidder was 80% in cash and only 20% in equity. Next client down, again, smaller client, but again, you have a $106,000 range in how the EBITDA was calculated by the 13 different bidders. And look at the range of the multiples bid for that practice. That practice ended up actually closing a couple of months ago at 10.1 times EBITDA, which is a record number for a practice of that size. These are a couple of other examples, just giving you an idea of the kind of multiples that we are achieving for great practices. These are probably up 20% versus 2019, and part of it is because of the number of bidders. Now let's talk about compensation. When calculating EBITDA, you have to make an assumption as to what the calculation is. The compensation on a go-forward basis is 100% negotiable, and they would love to pay you whatever you want to be paid as long as it is above industry standards. They will not pay you less than industry standards. Now, doctors, once they understand the math and once they understand the tax ramifications, would love to work for $1 a year. Problem is, I can't get the buyers to agree to that because it jacks up the initial value of the transaction so much that they are not willing to do that. But these are fairly typical ranges on a go-forward basis for compensation for doctors in the various specialties and GP. But these numbers can have a massive impact on the value of your practice. I was on the phone with an oral surgery practice this week. He had a bid from a well-known invisible DSO. The bid was about $5 million. And I said, that's a ridiculously low bid. What did they use for compensation in calculating that? He said 45% of collections. I said, well, here's the math. Most buyers are interested in 33% of collections on a go-forward basis. And that 12% swing on your practice would increase your EBITDA by over double. Therefore, I believe your practice, if you were to take a 33% compensation versus 45 as they have proposed, your practice would not be worth $5 million, but it would be closer to $11 million. So would you rather make an extra 12% of collections for the next 5 years, or would you rather get an extra $5 million or $6 million in value up front? So understanding how compensation impacts the overall value of your practice is critical. The only good thing that I know of that came out of COVID are what's called the COVID Earnouts. Now, COVID Earnouts were created during COVID for doctors in 2021, and they have continued on into 23, which basically say, we understand that your performance has been impacted by COVID in the last 12 months. Therefore, we still want to do a deal today, and we're going to price the deal or value your practice based on the trailing 12 months of performance. However, we know that you are continuing to grow and you have survived the COVID impact, and we will reprice the transaction 12 months after closing, 2 years after closing, and sometimes 3 years after closing. And so they will functionally pay you at today's high multiple for your future growth in years 1, 2, and sometimes year 3. And so functionally, you can lock in today's high multiples for the growth of your practice in the next 1, 2, and 3 years. Now, how you set that measurement is critical. And sometimes you want to tie it to bottom line or EBITDA, and sometimes you want to tie it to collections revenues. It'll depend on the partner and depend on what they're bringing to your relationship as to how you want to tie that COVID earnout. But the COVID earnouts can be increase the value of a practice that's growing by 20, 30, 40, 50% in some cases. So if you've just hired a new associate and they haven't yet kicked in value to you, or you've just finished building out a new office, or you've expanded your existing office, a lot of doctors will say, oh, wait, well, I just finished this. I want to get the benefit of what I've built here, or my new associate's production kicking in, so I want to wait. Well, if you're planning to do a transaction in the next 2 or 3 years, that's a mistake, because today you can lock in today's high multiples and get paid for that future performance that is embedded in your practice. And the good news is it's all upside and no downside. So if you don't deliver any growth, it's not going to impact your initial value, and that you will not be penalized for not growing, but you'll have a massive amount of upside if you do grow. And keep in mind, these partners can help you grow. Each one is different. Some can help you recruit. We have one group with which we've partnered about a dozen orthodontists over the last couple of years. And the average practice that we partnered with them saw an increase in production of 28% in the first 12 months after partnering with this particular group who was exceptionally good at digital marketing. Now, as a caveat to that, they targeted practices that had lame or limited marketing because they knew that if they could overlay their existing digital marketing strategies, that they could grow those practices significantly. But still, some of these groups have resources that can help your practice grow dramatically. So let's talk about the numbers of a very simple example of an earnout. The practice had $1 million in EBITDA. This was a transaction done about 3 years ago at 7 times EBITDA. Today, that practice would be worth 8.5 times EBITDA. And in this particular case, it was a very simple earnout. It was that they would pay the same initial value multiple for any incremental growth in EBITDA. So in this example, the practice grew from $1 million to $1.2 million in the first 12 months. And therefore, the value of the earnout was the initial multiple of 7 times the $200,000 incremental increase in EBITDA, which resulted in an extra $1.4 million for the doctor paid in the 13th month after the initial closing of the transaction. I hate to use this title, a typical deal, because there are no typical deals. These transactions are not cookie cutter. These transactions are all customized to meet the goals of the doctor and the invisible DSO partners. And we see a lot of interesting customization. So for instance, we've done several transactions where a doctor says, you know what, I really was planning to leave this practice to my son or daughter. And how do I make sure that they get the opportunity to become an equity holder in the practice and get to work in the practice once they graduate from dental school? And we have doctors asking for this with kids that are still in high school, and that is completely doable. The invisible DSOs are eager to offer ownership opportunities to the offspring of the doctors. And so we've seen contracts where the doctor's 18-year-old offspring has a contract that once and if they get through dental school, they have a job. And that's good business for the invisible DSO, and the doctors are happy about it. But there are a number of ways that you can use these transactions. For instance, if you promised equity ownership to one of your associates, this is an opportunity to fulfill that promise. We've done transactions for multi-doctor practices where you might have had 4 or 5 doctors in the group. The younger doctor's 34, the older doctor's 63. The older doctor wants to get all cash and retire. The younger doctor wants more equity, less cash, because he's planning to be around for another 30 years, and he gets to watch the value of his equity grow up. So each of these transactions are customized to meet the needs of the specific doctors. And if you structure them right, about 94% of the cash that you receive at closing can be taxed at long-term capital gains rates, which are only 20% federal versus the 37% for ordinary income. The doctor is going to retain ownership in a typical deal. That ownership may reside at the practice level, it may reside at the parent level, and it may be a combination of both. Again, all customizable for what the doctor finds most valuable. Now, all doctors are going to sign an employment agreement. That employment agreement is going to have negotiated how many days a week or a year the doctor is willing to work. It's going to have a non-compete radius that is also negotiable, as measured in blocks in Manhattan and measured by counties in some states, and measured in miles from the existing practice in others. But these are very definitive contracts, and the groups, without exception, honor these contracts because you are the golden goose. Many doctors have this perception that these groups are interested in replacing the owner doctors with cheaper labor down the road, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. The reality is, if you wanted a lifetime contract in one of these transactions, the groups would be more than happy to give you a lifetime contract. We always recommend our doctors sign 5-year employment agreements with, at the doctor's option, the ability to extend it another 5 years and another 5 years, a rolling extension in essence. We've had some doctors request longer contracts, and we have suggested that they stick to 5 with them having the option to extend. And I think we've only done one employment agreement longer than 5 years, which was a specific doctor who was adamant he wanted a longer than 5-year contract. So he did a 7-year employment contract. Again, back to customization. If you have a multi-doctor practice and you're interested in retiring in 1 year, that's completely doable. You can use these transactions to buy out partners. And in most cases, these groups are interested in having you work in the future at the same rate that you worked in the past, meaning they're not going to ask you to work any harder. We've never done a transaction where the doctors were requested or obligated to work any harder than they worked last year. On the other hand, we've done a number of transactions where the doctor says, you know what, I'm happy to sign up and keep my name on the door and lead my practice for the next 5 years. And I'll work at my current pace for the next 3, but I'd really like to slow down in years 4 and 5. And that is completely doable in most cases. So let's talk about the right time in your career to consider an invisible DSO partnership. First and foremost, whether you're even thinking about a partnership or not, we should have a conversation. You and me, it'll take about 20 minutes. And worst case, you'll learn something, because the odds are pretty good that I have some knowledge of your market as to who is there from an invisible DSO perspective, or who might like to be there from an invisible DSO perspective. And if the entire concept of it is of interest, then we can sign a mutual non-disclosure agreement that binds you to nothing except confidentiality and us to the same. And we'll take a look at 3 years of P&Ls, and my analysts will ask you some questions. And then you and I can have a conversation about what's possible from a value standpoint. And there's no obligation. In worst case, you're going to learn something. And we've had many practices after our evaluations ask me the question, okay, what should I be doing differently? How can I be better? And we're always happy to provide them with suggestions on where their numbers might be a little bit out of line, or how they might improve the value of their practice in the coming years. And the only thing that we request is that when you decide you're ready to explore a partnership, that you give us a call. So this is the interesting part. Unfortunately, not every doctor will qualify for an invisible DSO partnership. There are exceptions to every rule, but as a general rule, doctors with an operating profit of at least $500,000 after doctor compensation are those that will qualify to achieve multiple bidders from quality invisible DSOs. Your growth rate is very relevant. And frankly, one of the most important things that matters in these transactions is the doctor's personality. A doctor with a personality, a vision, and a plan is going to get a higher value than a short-sentenced curmudgeon dentist, of which we've all met them. If you've got a vision, a growth plan, and a personality, you are going to achieve a higher value. And in some cases, that can result in millions of additional dollars. So part of our job is to coach our doctors in the best ways to tell their story, to show their vision for the future and what the growth opportunities are in their community. So ideal practice traits. One of the interesting things since COVID that has been a metric for value is the rate of your team turnover. Practices that have long-term stable teams are more valuable than those which have experienced very high turnover. If you're in an area with growing population, that's an ideal practice trait. Few owners is an interesting topic that I often get questioned on. When you have, and we've done transactions where practices had 10 or more owners. In fact, we have a client right now that has 14 owners. And trying to get 14 owners to agree on anything is pretty difficult. So sometimes the invisible DSOs will pay higher prices for groups which have fewer doctor owners, not more doctor owners, or groups that have designated a very clear decision maker and spokesman who can speak for the group without having to have a vote amongst the group. So if you have a larger multi-doc practice, we should talk about how we approach that. Doctors who know their numbers are interestingly more valuable than doctors who do not. Doctors who can talk about the metrics of their practice. Yep, this week's production was X, we grew by Y. Those doctors are perceived as more valuable than doctors who do not know their numbers. Doesn't mean that's a requirement. I'm just saying that's a bonus. Doctors who are eager for equity and understand the potential upside in the equity are always more popular than doctors who, like my doctor whose 5 million grew to 35 million at our closing of that. He said, you know, Chip, I'm thrilled that you got 17 million for our practice, but the 12 million I just put in my bank account is more than I thought I'd ever get out of it. So that $5 million in equity is just a cherry on top. Now, at that point, had I been smart, I would have offered to buy his $5 million in equity, since at that point, he did not consider it to be valuable. But now that that $5 million is worth over 35 million, he is singing a different tune, as you can imagine. As far as updated facilities and technologies go, you do not have to be on the bleeding edge of technology, but it will help if you have modern, up-to-date offices and technology. The other thing that adds value is when you can talk about things that you can do that will add value to your practice that you have not yet executed, either because of capital restraints, because of time restraints, because of COVID or whatever. But when you can lay out an identifiable gain that can be achieved, you know, in the next 1, 2, or 3 years, you're going to add value to your practice in this process. And also synergies with other practices in the area. We get very high values for doctors who are eager participants in organized dentistry. We have sold the presidents of multiple state associations, multiple regional arms of AAO or AAPD. When you're actively involved in organized dentistry, your practice is going to be more valuable because the invisible DSOs will look to you to refer your friends to them. And obviously you're influential if 8,000 doctors have voted you to be the president of the Florida Dental Association, for example. So those doctors who are active in organized dentistry are going to often achieve a higher value. Another example, a recent transaction that just closed. This was a large pediatric practice. The doctor had been too busy doing pedo to set up an ortho operation. He was doing about $6+ million in pedo collections, which means in typical math, he was sending some lucky orthos about $3 million in production for ortho. And his pitch to the invisible DSO bidders that came for dinner, because typically you'll have, let's call it 6, 8, or 10 bidders. We're going to pick 3 or 4 of those bidders to come and do an after-hours practice tour and then dinner with us, the doctor, and the prospective bidders. We're going to do that on 3 or 4 consecutive nights so that we create competitive pressure. But in this particular case, the pediatric dentist, who was relatively young and was not in the mouth anymore, said, you know what I'd like to do when I have you as my partner is I would like to add ortho across my 4 practices, because I believe that it can increase the revenues in my practice by at least 50%. Now, this was an honorable guy, and he had told me early on, he said, if the orthos that I currently refer to would like to join and become your client and partner with the same group that I do, that would be great. But if they don't, I'm going to have to start my own ortho practice. And I know they'll be mad at me because they're not getting the referrals anymore. But at least I can sleep at night knowing that you gave them the option to participate in this. So highest value practices in 23. I'm going to beat the young drum again. Again, I'm 63, so it pains me to do that. Geography is interestingly less important than it was in 2019. Yes, the Sun Belt states and yes, the growing states are more valuable, but the flyover states, as I'll call them, have become more valuable than they used to be. So you can go to Iowa or Kansas or North Dakota or South Dakota, where we have done transactions in all of those states, and there are a lot of opportunities there. The initial values change weekly. The long-term value potential is fairly static, but a lot of these transactions are based on timing and knowledge. Our oral surgery practice in Florida, doing about 18 million in collections, we were able to get an exceptional value because we knew a group that was interested in becoming an implant and all-on-X only invisible DSO platform. Your associates, both current and future, will have ownership opportunities either at the practice level or the parent level, and these are all very creatively structured to benefit the associates. Taxes matter in this business. This is all about net gains, and how you structure these transactions is very important. And unlike what many accountants tell our clients, the Obama tax, the 3.8%, does not apply in these transactions. And we're very pleased with our goodwill number that we've negotiated, which is taxed at long-term capital gains tax rates. Now, if you own your own building, as many doctors do, you're going to have two great options. You're going to collect rent from a AAA credit tenant for the next 15 years, or your building is now an investment grade piece of real estate because of the tenant quality, and therefore there are a dozen or more real estate investment trusts eager to actually buy your property from you because of the tenant you now have. Most commonly asked questions that we get are autonomy, autonomy, autonomy. Are they going to leave me alone? Can I do my own schedule? Can I pick the supplies, the vendors, et cetera? What changes and what doesn't? Yes, there will be changes. People are going to take over your accounting, your payroll, your benefits administration, your compliance, and your credentialing, but you're going to find out exactly what those changes are in our process before you choose a partner. The impact on your team ultimately is shock, but ultimately the teams are very happy because they're typically ending up with better benefits at a lower cost. You are who is doing the hiring and firing. These are your team members. Certainly these groups will help you recruit new team members, but ultimately you're making the decisions. One of the things I counsel doctors against doing is do it yourself. You are experts at creating beautiful smiles. You are not an expert at doing dozens of multi-million-dollar transactions. And that's who will be on the other side of the table when you are negotiating a partnership, is an executive or executives plural who have potentially done billions of dollars of transactions and are pretty good negotiators. And frankly, you don't want to do one of these transactions by yourself. If you don't want to use large practice sales, that's okay. But I urge you to use at least one of the little advisors out there. Do it yourself is not the right choice in this business. And when you use the little advisors, make sure and ask them the fun question: how many transactions have they done in the last year? And most importantly, are they getting paid a fee by the buyer? The reason LPS is able to get as many bidders as we do is because we don't get paid by buyers. So we can show our clients to everybody, not just the limited invisible DSOs, that will also pay an advisor a fee. So when you find an advisor who is quoting you a lower fee than us, you will generally find that they are also being paid by the buyer, and they neglected to tell you that. And we think, A, that's a conflict of interest, but B, you really want to see all of your options. So our process is pretty simple. We want to understand your goals. We want to have you interview and date as many prospective partners as possible. And then we're going to help you through the lawyers, the tax, and get a transaction closed. Every doctor is invited to give us a call, set up a time to talk to me, and we would be happy to look at your financials and give you an idea of what's possible from a value standpoint. We limit these to practices that are big enough to qualify to ultimately partner with an invisible DSO. But give us a call and let's talk about your practice. And I appreciate your time. Unfortunately, this is not with question and answers, but if anybody would like answers to any questions that you have, please email me. I am chip@largepracticesales.com, and I respond to every email personally. Thank you, doctors. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Chip, for a wonderful presentation this evening, and thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Thank you all and have a good night.